On March 19, 1966, the University of Maryland hosted the NCAA National Championship game. The two teams that played that night were the powerhouse and four-time victors of the NCAA title, the University of Kentucky. They were driven by the famous coach Adolph Rupp. With their 4 NCAA titles already, they're profoundly expected to win their 5th title that night. The other team who Kentucky would be playing that night was a team hardly anybody knew, Texas Western, coached by Don Haskins. As the commentator announced the starters' names, the fans and watchers looked on and were shocked from the stands and on their TVs. 5 white Kentucky players took the court to clash with 5 black players from Texas Western. 1966 was a time when black athletes were not considered equal to whites, especially in the South. These black athletes were not expected to hold a candle to the 5 white starters from Kentucky. The game's outcome, to all watching that day, dispelled the belief that African Americans could not compete, and the result of this win had a significance beyond just a basketball game. Texas Western's first national victory with all African American players allowed doors to be opened for those who were limited by their differences, and for basketball to become more diverse and progressive.
Before the 1966 game, prejudice and isolation towards African Americans was a regular event, particularly in the South. It went as far as black people not having the liberty to have the same adequate schooling or utilize the same facilities as white Americans. In general, anybody who was considered African American had the Jim Crow laws acting upon them. During the 60s, more individuals began standing up for social equality. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader and speaker of civil rights developments during this time frame. He led Americans through the country to battle for the privileges of black Americans. Another enormous supporter of social liberties for black people during this time was John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who progressed in the direction of equal rights for all, until both their assassinations. Numerous individuals believed that after the assassination of both brothers, all chances for equivalent rights were gone, shot down with the Kennedy brothers. This was not the case. The Civil Rights Act began by President Kennedy was at last completed and passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1963. The law enabled black Americans to legally be able to have the same treatment as white people concerning public transportation and public accommodations. Yet just because legally black Americans should be treated equally did not mean all Americans perceived African Americans as capable of achieving what white Americans could.
Although some people were able to grasp the concept of everyone being treated equally, there were still many individuals that opposed the civil rights movement, as northern schools like Hampton University in Virginia and Lincoln University in Pennsylvania slowly would bring black players to their basketball team. Southern schools and fans began to lash out. Teams with black players would generally need to leave their black athletes at home in fear of death threats and abuse. These were several of the dangers that Don Haskins and his Texas Western Miners faced during their first season.
They said that a lot of people were going to get shot up during the games, so you got to watch your step. And Neville Shedd was, he was like panicking in the streets. Hey, you're going to get shot up, you're going to get shot up regardless of where you're in the streets or wherever.
Don Haskins coached a girls' high school basketball team before taking the job at Texas Western to coach their men's basketball team. He could only recruit so many players due to the small amount of money given to him by the school. Bobby Joe Hill, a recruit from Detroit, was only 5'6", yet he stood out on the court, being one of the top scorers on the team. He didn't allow his size to limit his abilities. Willie Cager was another African-American recruit that Don Haskins selected. He suffered symptoms of a heart condition he had suffered from his entire life. Despite this interfering with his physical health, he still played well. Don Haskins said himself that his intention was never to make a difference in the segregation of basketball. He simply wanted to win the game by putting his best players on the court, and his best players weren't defined by race, background, or size.
Don Haskins, along with his family, faced ups and downs in their lives. Don Haskins and his family received hate mail that affected his personal and mental health. The team also had very little to work with in the beginning. Their equipment and gym was subpar at best. They also didn't have as much local support in the beginning because their families were all in the north and on the East Coast.
There were 7 African American players that were the only ones to play in the NCAA National Championship game. Those players were Bobby Joe Hill, David Lattin, Willie Worsley, Willie Cager, Orsten Artis, Neville Shedd, and Harry Forney. Don Haskins did not recruit any white players because they had either already committed to another school or they had no interest in playing at Texas Western. There were only 5 white players on the team before Don Haskins got the coaching position. The 7 he did recruit were who Don Haskins said to be his best players, so they were the only ones to come in and out of the final game. They were dependable, only losing 1 game that season. Bobby Joe Hill was the top scorer of the game with 20 points, and behind him were David Lattin with 16 and Orsten Artis with 15 points. They also only allowed Kentucky to score 62 points in the championship game. Haskins taught his players to use good defensive strategy that was disciplined, and that's how they would control the game. Texas Western had been underestimated the entire season. They had only lost 1 game, but people didn't want to believe that they could actually be one of the best in the division. From the beginning of the final game, Texas Western was proving themselves. Pat Riley was fouled on the first tip for jumping early, and Texas Western gained the first possession, giving them a good start to the game. The score was close, but by halftime the Miners were leading 34-31. Quickly after the start of the second half, Kentucky scored, but Texas Western tied the game and maintained their lead until the end. Their 75-62 win over Kentucky in the championship game allowed them to prove themselves to those who doubted them.
This win had a large impact on society, for it showed people that the color of your skin or the characteristics that set you apart from the others don't have to limit you from accomplishing your goals or pursuing your talents. After the Miners won the championship, the town of El Paso threw a parade. Over 10,000 people were there, and people did not care that the team was comprised of all African American players. They were just proud to have such a successful team. People in the town, as well as teachers of Texas Western, watched the games with excitement and cheerfulness. People would drink when they won and would scream when the game was going downhill. Everyone just wanted the same thing, for the team to win, which brought the town together as one. It was a milestone in the civil rights movement, not only for El Paso, but for many across America, helping to change views about race.
Texas Western's victory had a large impact on basketball. More schools began accepting African American students and players, and by the next year, statistics showed that each college team in the South had at least 1 black player. This was tremendous because the inclusivity began to progress as time went on, and it helped improve the game of basketball. Now, African Americans make up 74% of the players on NBA teams. Many of the most successful and talented players of our time were also African American, such as Kobe Bryant. Texas Western's win seemed like fate. The matchup against Kentucky was the perfect mismatch of game and individuals. The simplistic, fundamental defensive basketball that Don Haskins worked with on the team served as an incredible advantage over Kentucky, and their size advantage made scoring on the opposite end much more achievable as well. Don Haskins viewed these players purely as players and didn't see color. This is really where it all started, because there were coaches like Adolph Rupp who said no 5 blacks are going to beat Kentucky, and Coach Haskins did not see color and was actually oblivious to the barriers he was breaking at the time. Don Haskins was even inducted into the Hall of Fame due to his triumph over all doubters and everyone who saw color and not talent.
Texas Western's win opened the door not only to college sports for African Americans, but to education. As college sports became more and more inclusive, African American athletes not only got the opportunity to play D1 sports, but they could get a good education that they were not exposed to otherwise. This butterfly effect continued to work, and schools began accepting more and more black students, realizing that they could have just as much talent, if not more, than other students. Looking at this, it is something that even translates to today's college age, where colleges actively pursue diversity, and in many cases, those who are considered more diverse actually have a better chance at getting accepted into schools.
This historic event not only broke barriers when it happened, but it allowed the players to use their newfound fame to continue to break racial barriers and fight racism. Particular players like Neville Shedd and Harry Florney used their publicity and voice to travel around trying to prevent racism throughout the country. This win not only put Texas Western on the map, but it shone the spotlight on racism and the ways people could stand against it. It made colleges do a double take and look for Bobby Joe, who may have been an overlook and could be the top scorer in the nation. The win sparked the public's questioning of racism and put away the old methods of recruiting and brought forth a whole new set of values and tactics in finding players for college teams. Not only did this break social barriers, but it reset the common outlook by college sports teams and forced them to recognize players beyond their appearances. It's not about talent, it's about heart. It's about who can go out there and play the hardest. They're not going to give us anything, so you've got to go out there and you've got to take it. Don Haskins.